and welcome to pmslounge.com. In this video, we will talk about how extreme programming team operates. How does the extreme programming team actually delivers projects, right? So in one of our previous videos, we talked about what extreme programming really is. And extreme programming is essentially a topic that you should know if you're preparing for your PMI-ACP certification exam, or even if you're preparing for your PMP certification exam, because PMP is 50% agile and hybrid. Agile umbrella is where you will find Scrum as well as extreme programming and some other methodologies as well. So always good to know about extreme programming when you're preparing for your PMP or ACP. All right, so let's talk about how extreme programming actually operates, right? How does this team actually work? And we are going to talk about four things essentially. Number one is how extreme programming team use stories, how they use quarterly cycles and weekly cycles, and number four is Slack. By the way, Slack is not the messaging software, right? There is a different concept called Slack, which is not something that you would find in Scrum. So this is something new. Stick around. Let's get started. All right. So the first thing to note is what are the similarities that extreme programming has with Scrum? What exactly is it that carries over as it is from Scrum to extreme programming? Number one is it is also an iterative and incremental methodology. So just like Scrum, XP is also both iterative and incremental. A quick reminder here, by the way, we recently did a video where we talked about the difference between iterative and incremental. I'll share a link to that video in the description below. As always, if you're into reading articles, the first link in the description is going to be an article on this topic, and you will also find a playlist where you will be able to find all the agile related videos and all the extreme programming related videos as well. So important links are in the description. Let's get back to the video. All right, so moving on, let's talk about how XP encapsulates the idea of making decisions at the last responsible moment. This basically comes from the second principle in the Agile Manifesto. We've already done a video on this as well, so a link to this video will also be there in the description. How decisions are made at the last responsible moment. Remember, we are not talking about delaying the decisions, right? We are talking about making the decisions at appropriate time. But above all of this, right, beyond both these points, just like Scrum, you will find XP teams also make use of stories. You will find that XP teams do a backlog planning, which follows a quarterly cycle. So once a quarter, the backlog is something that the XP team goes over, and this is then the quarterly cycle is then further broken down into iterations, which are known as weekly cycles. So every week, the XP team is essentially delivering a working software. Unlike in Scrum you used to deliver working software every 2 weeks, right? That was how a sprint looked like. For most of the teams, a sprint is a 2-week cycle. For some of the teams, sprint can also be a 4-week cycle. But here in extreme programming, what you're going to see is the iterations, the cycles are weekly cycles. So every week, the XP team is delivering a working software. Slack is a new practice that XP teams use by adding extra capacity to each iteration. And we'll talk about all four of these in the coming slides, so stick around. Let's start things off with stories. What are stories? And we have already done a video on it that will also be linked in the description. But let's take a quick overview of what stories are. Stories in XP are same as Scrum. That's the first point that you need to be aware of. And XP teams also add a rough estimate and may even use planning poker for estimation. So everything is pretty much same as Scrum when it comes to stories. Now, the XP teams can also use the format, right? As I want to show that format. This is also pretty common in XP. This is how a story looks like, right? You have a title of the story, you give it some story points. This is essentially the estimate of how long it is going to take to deliver this story, and then you have the format as maybe a user or maybe someone who is a paid member. I want to whatever the feature is, and then whatever the result of that feature is, so that what I want to happen as a result. So this is how story cards or stories are defined in both Scrum as well as Extreme Programming. A quick reminder here, if you're looking for PMP book recommendations, head over to pmclounge.com/resources. We have listed the most up-to-date books that you should be buying to prepare for your PMP exam. Okay, quarterly cycle. So let's talk about what happens in quarterly cycle. So team is going to meet once a quarter to discuss the following. And when we say team, we are talking about the Extreme Programming team. And in fact, in the quarterly cycle, you will also see that the customer also joins. So team reflects on what happened in the past quarter. So this is more like a retrospective of sorts. Team discusses the big picture, that is the company's focus, and how the XP team fits into it, right? This can also mean what is the customer's focus, right? So totally depends on the kind of work the team is doing, but essentially the point is to see the big picture. Plan themes for the quarter to ensure long-term goal alignment. Each theme is an overall goal used to group stories together. So what's happening here is there is this beautiful concept of themes, and we'll touch on it later as well. But first, let's talk about point number 4, which means plan the backlog for quarter along with users and stakeholders. So you're going to plan the backlog for the remaining quarter. Remember, you're doing a quarterly cycle meeting, so the quarter is yet to begin. So you are going to plan what all stories should be part of this quarter, right? Now back to number 3, plan themes for quarter to ensure long-term goal alignment. And each theme is an overall goal used to group stories together. So there could be certain stories which belong to a certain theme, right? Which belong to a long-term goal that the customer has or that the company has. So that can be called a theme. And in fact, XP teams use themes to make sure they don't lose sight of the big picture. A theme is just like a sprint goal in Scrum, that is a sentence or two that describes what they want to accomplish. So think of themes as sprint goals, right? What you want to accomplish in the next 2 weeks. This is what you define in sprint goal, but in themes, what you're defining is these 4 stories belong to a certain theme, and with these 4 stories, so and so is the goal that we want to achieve. All right, moving on, let's talk about weekly cycle, and this is where the work actually gets done. So just like the Scrum, the XP team chooses stories that are done by the end of the week and a working software is delivered. So your stories should be done by the end of the week and a working software must be delivered by the end of the week. So this is happening every week, right? Each week starts with a meeting where the team demos the working software for the changes they have done last week. So your sprint demo, right? This is essentially happening in your weekly cycle meeting. You are demonstrating what you have done in the last week. Secondly, the team works with customer to pick stories to be delivered this week. So what all should be in the scope for this week is what is discussed. And then the team also decomposes the stories into tasks. Now what happens after this is pretty interesting, because XP teams, just like Scrum teams, they are self-organizing teams. So they create a pile of tasks. Remember, they decomposed the stories into tasks and then they created a pile of tasks, and each XP team member is going to pull tasks from this pile that they have created. The weekly cycle starts on the same day each week, and even the planning meeting is held at the same time each week. So you might think this is more like a 9 a.m. Monday morning meeting, right? But that is where you would be wrong. So customer is also part of this meeting. And why I said Mondays 9 a.m. is wrong, because Mondays is something that the extreme programming teams typically avoid. So they don't want the teams to feel that they need to work on weekends to finish something by 9 a.m. Monday morning, right? So what happens is these weekly cycle meetings are usually held on Tuesdays or Wednesdays. So every Tuesday or every Wednesday, that's where you will find this weekly cycle meeting to be held. Finally, let's also talk about Slack. And before we go there, here's a quote from Keith Haring, and it says, "Nothing is important So everything is important. What this essentially means is you need to make sure that whatever stories that are important, right now we are talking in terms of extreme programming, so whatever stories that are important, that's something that the team obviously works on. But then there should also be good to have stories, there should also be stories which are not as important, and that is what Slack is all about. So Slack is essentially stories that are good to have, nice to have, right? So XP teams add a Slack in every plan. That is, they include a small number of optional or minor items. These items could be stories, these items could be defect fixes, which are not really big defects, right? So that they can drop if they start to fall behind. So if the team starts to fall behind, they can drop these stories, these items from the scope. So this is what Slack is all about. There are also hack days, there are also geek weeks. Their role is basically to allow the teams to work on their own work related projects and follow up on good ideas that may have gotten swept under the rug, because perhaps they were just good to have, perhaps they were just stories that the XP team members felt very passionate about, but the customer never found them high on the priority list. So these are all good to have, nice to have stuff that the teams are going to add as Slack in the weekly cycle. Now, don't go overboard with it. Usually only one or two Slack items, that is only one or two stories or defects, are included in the weekly cycle. So typically Slack takes less than 20% time in the weekly cycle. So what this means is 80% of the time what the team is going to work on are high priority items, and then 20% Slack can be added, so that even if you fall behind on those 80% items, you can move these 20% items to the next weekly cycle. So that's the precise concept of what Slack really is. Question for this video before I let you go: what are your thoughts about Slack? Do you use it? Do you think even non-XP teams should use Slack? Let me know in the comments. Definitely looking forward to your answers. And that's all that we have in this video. Like, share, subscribe. If you like our work, consider contributing by using the thanks button or by heading over to pmclounge.com/contribute. Do check out the important links in the description, and don't forget to check out our website pmclounge.com, your #1 free PMP and project management resource. Thank you and have a nice day.